All right, let's get started. Thanks for joining us. I'm Lanae Erickson. I'm an SVP at Third Way and really excited to have everyone here on the conversation this morning. It's convention week, obviously, so all eyes across the country are on politics right now. And I think if there's one group of voters who are changing the face of American politics in more ways than one, it's young people. Since the election of Donald Trump, there's been a beginning of what you might call a generational revolution in politics. There's young people are engaging more, activating, voting, running for office themselves in record numbers. And so we really wanted to dig into what they're thinking ahead of this crucial election in November. Since I'm what I call a vintage millennial and feeling every single day in quarantine, I no longer feel qualified to opine on exactly what's going on with the youth in America. So I thought we should bring together some folks who really have their fingers on the pulse of young people in politics today to talk about it. So I've got three wonderful speakers here to join us today for this conversation. We have Antjuan Seawright, who's the founder and CEO of Blueprint Strategies. We have Michelle Mayorga, Vice President at GBAO Strategies. And we have Layla Zaidane, Executive Director and COO at Millennial Action Project. So we'll get the conversation started with these folks, but we really want to let you all ask questions too. So throughout the conversation, please type in the chat any questions you have, and after we talk for a bit, I'll start to incorporate your questions. So thanks very much, and let's get going. So we're talking about young voters, but let's start by talking about what that means. There's a lot of ink has been spilled analyzing my generation, the millennials, but now there's more and more of Gen Z are really activated and reaching voting age. How are those two parts of what you might call the young voters different or similar? And what do you think their top tier issues are right now when it comes to politics? And I'll start with Antjuan, and then I'll let Michelle and Layla jump in.
Well, I'll just say this. I sometimes get lost in the alphabet soup between Gen X, Y, and Z. But I'll make reference to that famous hip hop philosopher by the name of 2 Chainz, and one of his songs where he says we need each and every one of them. Every means every one of them. And that's how I feel about the young vote. There's some things we should just keep in mind. Every major movement in this country has been galvanized and energized by young people. And you can look back at history, in more recent history, young voters, young minority voters in particular, helped drive President Obama's victory with a almost 49% turnout in 2008. When you think about the fact that in 2016, the millennials made up almost 26% of the electorate. And in this upcoming election, millennials are anticipated to make up over a third, and that's almost 37% of the electorate. And while roughly 43% of eligible voters in this country are under the age of 45. And so I say all those numbers to say that we will help shape what this democracy looks like. People under the age of 45. And so if we care about what we want this country to look like, if we're not pleased with what we see today, then our anticipation is very important. We can go through the issues and categorize them by what's important, but what's important to me may not be important to you. But what I do know is they're important to all of us. And I think we have to look at this election in that way, through that lens.
Michelle, what are you seeing in the numbers that you're, I'm sure, consistently in the field around these questions?
Sure. I mean, in terms of sort of the differences between millennials and Gen Z is, I wouldn't say that there's like a lot of huge differences, but that Gen Z is everything millennials are times 10, right? So everybody talks about how diverse millennials are. Gen Z is even more diverse. And some people talk about how, millennials grew up with the internet and grew up with, social media. Gen Z, they're beyond that. Like, what do you mean? Of course, they grew up with social media. It's sort of everything millennials are times 100, right? And they care about a lot of the same things. Until recently, climate change was, and we'll I think, talk more about this, but climate change is a really, really big issue. It's still a really big issue, but COVID is really top of mind right now. And the way that millennials and Gen Z are sort of interacting with that is a little bit different, because they're worrying about school, they're worrying about people they know having it, they're worrying about, are they going to get jobs, are they going to have healthcare, are they going to be able to pay if they have healthcare and get sick, are they going to be able to afford it? So like most of us, COVID is really top of mind, with some caveats that it's a little bit different. But yeah, that's sort of the, I would say, top level differences in what we're seeing.
And Layla, you think about young voters all the time, but also young electeds, and there's so many of the young people that are voting are also running themselves. What are you hearing from those folks?
Yeah, and you know, I think both Antjuan and Michelle made such great points that I want to kind of pick up on. I think this idea of, right, young people caring about issues like climate and kind of these big future focused problems that traditionally have been defined on kind of left and right are now very much defined on future past. And I think one interesting thing that we're seeing with millennials and Gen Z is that they actually look a lot more like each other across party lines than they do some of their older counterparts. And from our electeds, we're seeing that as a huge opportunity to reach out to people on some of these big issues like climate, like healthcare, that really matter to the generation as a whole. And the other thing that I'd just like to underline is kind of this idea of big change being driven in the country by young people. Every kind of major movement in history has been driven by a young person. And we actually had an event a couple weeks ago where we were so fortunate to be able to have Martin Luther King III come and speak to our group. And we asked him, you know, would your father have used Twitter if he had it available to him? He was like, absolutely. Like, you have to use every modality that you have to create change. And Gen Z, kind of to your point, Michelle, is like an exaggerated version of millennials when it comes to being able to leverage social media and being able to use their civic voices online. And I think we're seeing a lot of that come out in this younger generation, just a sophistication with the technology in order to drive kind of change on some of these issues that really matter to them.
Can I follow up on one thing about that? You know, I think that young people have figured out what the younger generation of the past figured out. We're either going to be at the table or on the menu. And that's why you see so many young people standing up, running for office. That's why you see us showing up at city halls, showing up at Congress, showing up at state houses, because we realize that's how we move the needle. And the problem I think we found in politics is that some of our elected officials, and I even say my party, have not figured out how to meet young voters where they are. I, as a 35-year-old Black man, care about the same thing that my sharecropping grandparents cared about. I care about healthcare. I care about how much I'm paid. I care about student loan debt. I care about education, climate. I just care about it in a different way, and how you articulate the importance to me may be a little different than you articulate to my mother and father, but it's still a priority issue for me. And I think if we want to really move the ball, and if we want to keep young people engaged, regardless of where they fall in the alphabet soup, I think it's so important that we meet people where they are. So it may not be at a traditional neighborhood meeting. It may not be at a Democratic Party convention. It may be on our cell phones. It may be by way of text message. It may be by way of email. It may be by way of Twitter. It may be by way of a happy hour. But that's where we are, and that's where our issues will happen to find us.
So we know that COVID is top of mind for so many voters, but young voters are really impacted by this pandemic in a unique way. They may not be mostly experiencing the worst kind of public health impacts, but they've certainly borne the brunt of the economic fallout. And as we see young folks going back to college, there's just so much uncertainty about what the future holds for them. How do you all think that this crisis in particular is going to affect both how young people vote this year and how they think about politics moving forward?
Sure, I can start. I don't want to say too much, but I was in a focus group the other day with some young Latinx voters, and a 26-year-old woman said to me, you know, I have never voted before, but the president's dealing with COVID made me sign up to vote 2 weeks ago, and I am definitely going. So I think that one, there is some motivator, but what I also think is really interesting out of sort of the COVID response and what we're seeing is I think that millennials and Gen Zers have a different sense of the role of the government, and they're getting a very first look at the role of government in our lives and how it can affect us at a really early age. I think we'll sort of see the repercussions of that in good ways, I'm sure, for a long time.
Yeah, I saw a stat that said 4 out of 5 young people have seen through the COVID experience how much political decision makers' actions actually impact their lives, which is kind of a staggering statistic to have. But I think, you know, that speaks to kind of this desire for somebody who's not going to pass the buck, who's going to take charge, who's going to take the responsibility seriously for kind of addressing this problem. And I think one other thing that's interesting to see is even more than concerns for their own economic outcomes, I think young people are concerned about the health of their parents or their grandparents. So kind of looking out for other people. And what does that tell you, that this generation or these 2 generations care more about other people than themselves? I think that speaks volumes about the types of leaders that they're looking for, ones who are empathetic while action oriented and are willing to, you know, make some tough decisions to solve problems.
You know, this pandemic has cut through the fabric of who we are, in particular Black and brown people. And that includes our parents, but it includes us, if you look at who's been disproportionately impacted by this. And so when you think about access to healthcare, when you think about just pure economics, when you think about just helping our families, because that's what we've had to do, particularly those of us who look like me, it has been a generational task to reach back and help people who have helped us. This pandemic has shined a bright light on some of the realities that we face. We start this race being 2 laps behind people who do not look like us. And so in order for us to have an attempt to catch up, then we have to find ourselves getting in the game, getting involved, and getting off the sideline. And so these issues are one thing when there's not a pandemic, but when they are a pandemic, the importance of these issues becomes times 10.
You know, we've mentioned, several of you have mentioned that these 2 generations, or all of these young people put together, are really the most diverse voters in American history, in I think every possible way. But particularly, they have a very different racial and demographic makeup than, say, the silent generation, who might be aging out of American politics. So how do you think that's impacted their participation in politics, their views around it? And I'd love to talk about both young people of color and their white peers and how they're kind of navigating replacing a generation that looks really different than they do. Layla, you want to start?
Yeah, happy to jump in, and I think that you're, you know, very right to point out that while they actually mirror a lot of the same kind of intrinsic qualities that we saw in some of those older generations about kind of public service and altruism and kind of idealism, but are so different in so many ways. And I think that, you know, kind of the point that I was making earlier about this interest in diversity in every sense of the word means a tolerance for diverse perspectives, diverse lived experiences, diverse demographics. And I think that growing up in that kind of environment gives you the familiarity and the ability to kind of engage across that difference effectively. And I think seek that difference intentionally in your representation and in the types of you know, leaders who are working to kind of solve problems in your community. And so I think that it's, you know, diversity is not just a kind of like an afterthought or kind of a you know, Benetton ad that you want to see just like a lot of different kind of faces at the table, but you really want a lot of different voices included in the conversation. And I think that's something that this generation really prioritizes, and that I think they are holding their leaders accountable for.
I definitely think what I believe, what my mentor and leader, Majority Whip Jim Clyburn, says in his memoirs when he says, "Our lives are the sum total of our experiences." For me, some of the same conversations we're having in my generation are some of the same conversations we've had in previous generations. And so while the people may be changing, some of the issues have not changed. So I think what we have to figure out is how we deal with those issues. And so the next generation does not have to have the same kind of discussions around the same type of issues. The challenge for, I think, my generation and perhaps the generation after me is finding how do you change the conversation. That means everyone may not serve in elected office. Everyone may not be appointed to something that will have impact on change, but everyone can vote. Everyone can show up to an engagement meeting, whether that's at the State House or at your house. Everyone can do their little part, I think, to help change the temperature and the tone, because if we don't, and if everyone tries to do the same thing to enact change, then we're going to continue to be in what I call a political rut for the next 2 or 3 generations.
Yeah.
I will just add that I think diversity across the board with sort of younger people is a given, right? They have grown up sort of more around diverse people. They know more diverse people. Like they are attuned to it. They know about it. They're gonna notice if something is not diverse, and I think that's a good thing. I think we'll just keep sort of seeing that as they grow older. But I think diversity is a given with them.
Layla?
Yeah, I really like what you said, Antjuan, about we can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. I think so often when we like think about change, we're like, oh well, it was so much better like 15 years ago or 20 years ago, like let's go back to that, and we have this new coalition of people who can help bring us back to that. But that's not at all what this generation is asking for. We want to define something new. We want to build something better, and we want to create something different that is rooted, I think, in a diversity that didn't exist 15, 20, 30, 50 years ago, and something that is truly inclusive of, I think, the patchwork and the different lived experiences of the young folks who we have today.
I think that word diversity means different things for different people. I know what it means for me as a 35-year-old Black man from rural South Carolina, based on my family's history. But I think what happened then and what we're dealing with now is different in this way when it comes to diversity. The complexion of this country is changing, whether people like it or not. And so that brings about a different conversation when it comes to what diversity looks like in our boardrooms, in our courtrooms, in our elected offices, or even in our neighborhood offices. And I think that is going to be the challenge for the generation or generations who have come before me, as they kind of still hold their comfortable seats and try to make adjustments, as we say in yoga, to what diversity may look like through today's lens.
So I'll invite participants. I see folks are starting to type some questions in the Q&A. Please start populating that, and I will get you into the conversation. I'll ask one more of my own questions before I start getting to our audience members. There's obviously a lot of stereotypes around young voters, who they are and what they care about, and whether they'll engage. What is the biggest stereotype that you think conventional wisdom gets wrong about young voters today? Michelle, I'll start with you.
Okay. You said what is the
what's the biggest stereotype that folks get wrong when they're assuming things about young voters right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of campaigns, I see this every day, are just assuming that they're disinterested and they're not going to vote. And I think that given the trends that we're seeing, that is just wrong, and they need to be paid attention to. And we're only going to see them sort of turn out more and more. And you have a couple of stats here. 43% of eligible voters under 30 voted in 2016. That is pretty low compared to sort of over 30. but it is trending in a direction that I think we're going to keep seeing go up and up. I think particularly this year, I think there's a lot of motivating factors. And I will say, I don't want to like blame this all on Trump, like Trump is this motivating factor for young people, because the truth is young people care much more about issues than sort of electability. If you're sort of on their side and they think that you stand with them, they will vote for you. They just don't think Trump does that for them, but it is not this like boogeyman of Trump himself. It's all the things he does and stands for and his policies. And so I think really making sure that we're communicating our policies on our side sort of out to the world, and making sure we're really having those conversations with young people and young voters so that they are informed and they are going to vote. The number one reason particularly young women aren't voting is because they don't feel informed. They don't feel like they know enough. They're getting into the ballot and they feel like they don't know enough about the candidates to make a choice. And so it's really on us to be having those communications and telling those stories and empowering people to go and do it. But they are voting more and more and more every cycle.
Yeah, I think that building off of that, they are not just voters, but they are candidates themselves. And Lanae, you referenced this at the top. We're about to come out with a number, so kind of sneak peek, I guess, for the folks on this call. But last year, or last cycle rather, in 2018, we had about 100 millennials win their primary elections and go into the general for a seat in Congress. This year, not counting the primaries that happened yesterday and the ones that still have to occur in the coming weeks, we've got almost 300 millennials who have won or are competing in primaries. And that's a huge, I mean, that's incredible. And I think when we talk about young people being potentially apathetic or disengaged, that couldn't be further from the truth. And everybody is finding the way that they can create change in their lives and the way that they can hold the levers of power and create, the progress on issues that they care about. And a lot of those young people are finding it in campaigns and in running for office. And so I think we have to remember that young people are not just in the streets protesting or online tweeting, but they're actually in those seats at the table, ready to listen to the folks who are asking them to pass substantive change.
I think probably the biggest mistake that people make about young people is that they make the assumption we're either out to lunch or we're just thinking life is one big party and we're trying to figure out what outfit or whether we're going to take Uber or Lyft to get there. And I think that's a mistake. Barack Obama would not be president without historic turnout by young voters in 2008. We would not have the most diverse and fragile majority in our nation's history if young people did not show up in the 2018 midterms. I don't know if the temperature or the tone would be so loud right now in this country if it were not for young people raising their voices, using bullhorns and getting to the streets, causing good trouble, necessary trouble, as John Lewis would oftentimes say. And so I think we have our hand on the power steering wheel. I think we want to decide what this country looks like. I think we just may do it in a different way than our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents did, because the challenges look a little different for us. And also, I think that people oftentimes mistake young people for not being able to do more than one thing at once. I know how to talk on the phone as well as write an op-ed piece. I think I have that gift. I think a lot of other people know how to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think that's the beauty about young people and how we have evolved, and we learn how to juggle more balls than one in the air at the same time.
So Antjuan, I'm going to throw this question from our audience back to you because, you're coming to us from, as you said, God's country in South Carolina.
That's right.
There are a lot of young people that live in really red places, either in rural areas within their states or within a blue part of a very red state. And they may feel even less power to kind of impact politics if they feel like running for office might be a fool's errand in a super red state. How do you talk to young people in red and purple places and get them jazzed to start engaging, even if it might not mean winning a Senate seat in that, in that state in this cycle?
Well, I tell them the truth. I tell them nobody understands that more than me. I'm young, 35, I'm Black, and I'm a Democrat, and I'm from South Carolina. So you can imagine all the things that come along with those things, and people essentially counting me out from the start. But every time people have counted me out or counted people I know out, we come around and teach them that they do not know how to count. And so you have to find yourself believing in the possibilities. When people tell you no, you figure out how to make their no into a hell no, I will not listen to you. I'm going to try it anyway. Because imagine if Doug Jones did not decide to run for the U.S. Senate in Alabama. He would not be the U.S. Senator right now. And I can name so many examples. We've continued to make history and progress in the rural South, where the political rubies have been traditionally read, but we keep chipping away at the block, bit by bit, election after election, cycle after cycle. And understand, change is a marathon, not a sprint. And direction sometimes is far more important than speed. But when we get to where we need to be, i.e. elected offices, or when we're on the crisp, or so close as Jamie Harrison is becoming the U.S. Senator from South Carolina, when we get that close, it's further proof and demonstration that you just have to keep trying. And when you get knocked down, you get back up and you try again. I think there's a song somewhere in the hip hop space that came out when I was younger that says, first you don't succeed, you get yourself up and try again. And I just appreciate the ability to try.
Layla, I know you work with candidates of both parties and really try to do a lot of work to elevate the voices of young people in the Republican Party as well. So, there could be a symmetry here, but what do you say to folks who might want to get engaged in a state where most people don't agree with their politics?
Yeah, and I think that's maybe like not the right frame of thinking, because you don't know that most people don't agree with your politics. Maybe your senator doesn't, but I sure as hell can guarantee you there's a school board member who agrees with your politics. There is somebody out there who is on the ballot, who needs your vote, who agrees with you and needs your support. And so, I would say not to get discouraged because the person at the very top of the ticket doesn't reflect you or your values, but think about all of the other ways in which we can create change in our communities and connect with our neighbors around our values and what we want to see done. And I think that applies certainly to both parties, but regardless of what state you're in, there's a way that you can make a difference, and it's on you if you sit out and disenfranchise yourself because you think that you can't make one.
Michelle, do you have anything to add there from the used to be red, now purple state of Arizona?
I'm actually in New Mexico. We used to be a purple state.
Oh, that's
and we called it turquoise wave.
That's right. Sorry, you're already blue. Yeah.
But I think that there's another sort of aspect of this, and particularly in sort of rural America and climate change being so top of mind for young people. I mean, climate change affects rural America maybe the most. They're working from the land and have to be prepared for climate change. And I think really taking the issues and making them specific to their life and what they're doing, I think is really important in red states. And also particularly again in rural areas, like you can flip a rural precinct with one vote, So, getting out there and voting is like sort of more crucial in those red states, and you can sort of see an impact even with a smaller number.
I'll throw another question out for any of you who have advice on this. I think somebody from the audience is curious about the fact that, Bernie Sanders won by massive margins with young people. And that in some polls you've seen socialism be more popular than capitalism with certain cohorts of young people. There's a lot of support for some things like Medicare for All and legalizing marijuana, none of which made it into the Democratic platform. So how can the party kind of evolve to offer something to those folks who are really more aligned with Bernie than Biden, and still kind of stay relevant for these folks who may have wanted to see the change come much, much more quickly?
Well, I'll say this: out of all the isms, isolationism is the worst of all the isms, and I think that's the worst thing we can do as Democrats. But keep in mind, the beauty about the Democratic Party, and this is why I love this party so much, is we are a big tent party. Our diversity is our strength, and not just in gender or race. That sometimes means in thought process too. And so, not everyone will think the same. Not everyone will feel the same. The priorities in California may look different than the priorities in South Carolina. That does not mean that the priorities are not priorities for each one of us. I think we have to keep that in mind. I also should remind everyone who feel like perhaps their version of priority or their version of focus is not what the Democratic Party as a whole thinks. No matter what differences we may have amongst each other, they do not compare to the differences we have with the other side or those who do not think that our issues matter. And I'll just make it relevant for this election. No matter the differences we have with our candidates at the top of the ticket or the bottom of the ticket, I can guarantee you they do not compare to the differences we have with Mike Pence, Donald Trump, and the Republican Party. And until we adopt that line of thinking, until we realize you cannot govern until you win, and losers do not legislate, none of the things that we all want to see will ever be changed because we're not there in the right positions to change them.
Michelle, as you're advising candidates how to, navigate energizing folks who maybe wanted to see bigger change in this time when pragmatism may have won out at the top of the ticket, how do you give folks advice on that?
Yeah, it's sort of interesting because I mentioned this a little bit before, but young people are really policy over electability. So, whereas sort of older voters just want somebody who can beat Trump, right? Like young people really do want people who are there on their issues. And the Democratic Party is going to have to figure that out and probably change a little bit. I will also say that just because it doesn't make it into the Democratic Party platform doesn't mean that that's not how, the electorate feels, for example. We have polled marijuana legalization in, toss-up states and red states, and it's pretty popular. We got to kind of move along on the policy sometimes. We're maybe a little bit behind in terms of the official Democratic Party platform, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's not where voters are, where young people are, and I think we'll see more and more, especially as we have more and more younger elected officials sort of trending in that direction. And a lot of times, sometimes there's also just a lot of agreement amongst generations. They just maybe don't call it the same thing, where young people are sort of comfortable saying that for socialism and older people are not. That doesn't mean that they don't all agree we shouldn't have public schools and public policing and all those sort of socialist things, and that we shouldn't have affordable health care that we all help each other with. And so a lot of times you have to sort of work it out and explain it out, but there is a lot of agreement, and there are a lot of things that we can sort of come together on. There's just young people are maybe a little bit more comfortable with some of the newer terminology.
Yes, as someone just pointed out in the Q&A chat, socialism may mean different things to different generations. And speaking of kind of conventional wisdom and assumptions about what young voters might be thinking about or where they might go, there's a lot of assumptions from older folks in the more establishment of politics that assume young voters will just get more conservative as they age, that these generations are not truly different, they're just different because they're young, and they will become much more like their elder generations over the next decade or so. What do you all think about that notion? And, do you think these changes or the differences between generations that we're seeing right now are going to persist as the current young voters go into different phases of life?
Yeah.
So I actually, as a data person, don't see a lot of data points to back this up. While people might maybe identify as being a little bit more conservative. Like, remember that recycling was like a very left-wing thing in the like 70s and 80s. It is like very much not so now as sort of young people grew up. And I think there's 1,000 examples like that. And so I don't think that there's like actually a lot of data points to show that people will actually become more conservative. They might be considered what's conservative in relation to whatever generation comes after them, but I don't know that that necessarily means that they like move into sort of what we think of as conservative.
Layla, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah. I mean, I'll just add that I think this is maybe another example of a time where language matters and the lines are not so defined right now as young people. We hold multiple truths at once, and we can believe in multiple things. And you know, young people are increasingly less likely to identify with either party. And so to say that they age into one or the other is maybe ignoring a larger trend and a larger opportunity that we really can be mobilizing young people, no matter your district, no matter your state, on issues, regardless of your current political affiliation. And just because, as I think, Michelle, it's a good point, like in relation to maybe a more progressive generation that comes behind you seem more conservative, that doesn't mean that you weren't always necessarily that way. And that's, I think, a huge opportunity for candidates who want to mobilize on that kind of openness and attitude.
I think we have to stop using these words, conventional, establishment, and all these, because they change. Those words mean different things from person to person and from election cycle to election cycle. The bottom line is we can't think about conventional wisdom because we're not living in conventional times. If we were living in conventional times, Donald Trump would not be the president of the United States. And so I think we have to throw all those things out of the window and recalibrate in our thought and the way we do business, because it's no longer business as usual. It's unusual business for most of us. And so whether you call yourself a progressive, yellow dog, blue dog, whatever you decide to be, the bottom line of us, most of us who think like most reasonable people in this country, we're Democrats. And so we all fit up under that umbrella, and we should govern ourselves accordingly under that notion. One band, one sound. That does not mean we have to think that his idea should be my idea or my idea should be her idea, but we also think our ideas matter and they far outweigh the other side when it comes to their ideas. And until we get to that place, we're going to be fighting each other. I figured out very quickly, being a lifelong Democrat, sometimes the hardest hits come from people who have on the same jersey as us, and that should not be the case. We should not be tackling each other who are on the same team. The real fight is with the other side or the other team, and we have to just make the necessary adjustments on that.
And Antjuan mentioned that nothing is usual this year. One of the things that is unusual is that colleges may not be the physical manifestation of get out the vote for young people in the way that they have been in previous elections. How are you seeing young people organize themselves when that kind of, setting up a table in the square of your college might not be the way that you can do it in a global pandemic?
Yeah, I can. I mean, I think it's really interesting because, as I said earlier, we're talking about generations of people who grew up with social media. They don't necessarily need the table in the square to find each other anymore, and they're doing it. They're doing it on social media, and they're very adept at it, and they're very used to it. So while 2020 is, certainly a crazy year for everybody, and maybe we don't have the physical geographic space to sort of come together and organize for young people. I think a lot of it is still happening. It's more so digitally and online.
Yeah, I think this speaks to the value of what you do between elections, because the people who are the most successful are the ones who have invested in the infrastructure and the networks of young people when there is not something that we're asking them to do, when we are not treating them like an ATM, when we are not just coming to them because we want them to vote for a particular candidate. And the investment in that infrastructure and that community and that you know, that kind of communications infrastructure allows people to then share information about how to vote during a pandemic or things that we could never have predicted, you know, a couple years ago. And so I think the organizing and the movement building that happens on off-cycle years or between kind of major presidential elections is almost more important than what we can be doing now.
I think that is so right, particularly when it comes to young voters of color. I think this party has to start treating young voters of color as an investment, not an expense. And so that means not just showing up in a presidential election cycle or 60 days out talking about how important your vote is, and then asking what can we do to earn your vote. But we have to ask them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, election year on, election year off, because every day is election day, and we should treat it like that. We should treat it as such. And the truth of the matter is, we should treat our relationship with consequential constituencies like young voters. We should treat it like a relationship. So it should be steady communication. It should be constant building of trust. It should be spending time. It should be reminding young voters why they matter. And then when they do show up, and when they do what we ask them to do, we have to say, as we say in South Carolina, what are the two most important words in the English language? And those words are thank you, and reward young voters for their good behavior.
So we're
Yeah,
almost.
I will just add to that.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Michelle.
I thought a really quick thing. I couldn't agree more. And, you know, something that we're seeing, particularly with young men of color, is that they are not necessarily voting for Democrats. I think they're taken for granted as like base voters for Democrats. And, you know, we're seeing it start to recede, and they're not supporting in the numbers that they maybe used to, or it takes more persuasion to sort of get them there. And so we really have our work cut out for us, and we have conversations to have and work to do.
That's great advice, and I will say we're right at the end of time, but I want to give each of you one more sentence. If you had to give advice to the people who are running campaigns and elections, trying to activate young people, candidates who are trying to reach them, and you have one sentence to give them advice about how to get young voters to the polls and get them activated, what is it? And I'll start with Layla.
I mean, I think the most important thing that we can share with young people right now is how to vote, because it's so different this year. So, you know, I guess my one sentence would just be educate young people on their voting options.
Antjuan and Michelle?
Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said this a few times, but that it's, you know, policy over electability. Like, you are probably a wonderful candidate that everybody should know about, but you've got to get out there and be talking about stances on the issues with young people. It really, really matters to them.
You will decide what your now and your future looks like. Vote or die.
And there's nothing you can do to top that last line. So with that, we'll mic drop and say thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.